Hi, so welcome back to Brown Bag History for 2025, our first one this year. We're talking today about Reclaimed Voices, which is the exhibit that you see in this room. Just wanted to give sort of an overview and an introduction to the exhibit and talk about some of the research that went into it and some of the interesting things that we discovered as we were doing it. So as we begin, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Snipes homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So the exhibit's called Reclaimed Voices. And we were able to do this thanks to a grant from Heritage BC. And when we thought about it, what I wanted to do was sort of look at stories that weren't traditionally told in the museum, or other museums. There's been a really big move to decolonize and to include voices that weren't always included before. And, when we look at our sources, our sources are the newspapers, which were written and edited by white British males. And there was all the community itself, the mayors, the councillors were all British white males. The leadership in all of the community organizations were British white males. So when you're seeing everything from that perspective, there's things that get lost or just not even considered. So the trick is to look beyond sort of the written record and look beyond what's easy to find and try to dig deeper and uncover some of these stories. So, that's the big thing, whose voices are missing, and how do you find those and how do you start to tell those stories? So that was the challenge that we started out with. And so I thought about some specific stories that we wanted to tell. And I did want to focus on women's history because that was left out a lot. And one of the first things I started with was the fact that women lost their names when they got married. So I'll introduce myself here. I'm Mrs. Ken English. That's how women were introduced. They were, there's the Mr. That's how women were introduced back then. That's how their names in public records, in the newspapers, they went by their husband's name. So I really wanted to delve into that a little bit and see how we could take one specific photograph and uncover their names. So on the panel that you see over there, we've got the same photograph, and you'll see those little pink tags. Those are their married names. Those are the names that they were identified by in public. Those are the names that we had them identified by in their photograph. And if you lift the magnet, the pink magnet on each of those, you'll see their given name. You'll see their first name and their family name. So for example, at the back, we have Mrs. Thomas Bradshaw. And if you lift her tag, I think it's, let's do that. And what is it? It's Alma Miller. I knew the Miller, I couldn't remember the first name. And out front here, this is Mrs. Charles Holton, and her name was Lida Silcott. So we have all of their names. There was only one person, the woman back here in white. I was not able to find her name. She's identified as Mrs. A. Brown, and I just couldn't pin her down. But all the rest, with a bit of research, I was able to find them. So we've got Mrs. David Swanee was Jessie Squires. Mrs. Thomas Downs was Susan Nesbitt. Mrs. George Larder was Charlotte Balfour. Her husband was a minister here. And this is Mrs. Brown, who I couldn't identify. Mrs. William Morris, who was Janet McLean, and Mrs. William Lawrence, who was Carrie Grant. And then at the front, we have Mrs. Harry Burfield, who is Ruth Martin. And this little boy is David Swanee, and he doesn't have a pig magnet because, of course, he would never have lost his name. And Mrs. Joseph Cressman, who's Maggie McMicken. Mrs. Fred Soames was Florence Sims. Mrs. Benjamin Blacklock was Hannah Titterington. Mrs. Colin English, no relation, was Sarah Riddell. But my daughter is also named Sarah. She was Sarah English before she got married. And Mrs. Charles Jaw was Maggie Kimberly, and Mrs. Thomas Crump was Eleanor Edwards. And her son was Buck Crump, who became the head honcho of CPR during his career. So it took quite a bit of research to find those names. They were that hidden. And I'll reintroduce myself. I'm Catherine Harrison. But it was interesting, doing that. And I saw an article in the local newspaper that was copied from I think the Vernon newspaper. This would have been like early 1960s, like 1962. And it was talking about this trend of newspapers starting to use women's first names and how that wasn't proper newspaper etiquette. And they used the example of it shouldn't be Mrs. Jackie Kennedy. It should be Mrs. John F. Kennedy. And that was still in the early 60s, and they were trying to hold on to that tradition of taking women's names away and identifying them by their husband. So that's I'm actually very fond of that particular panel. I really liked that idea of being able to recover those women's names. And we've also talked about some women who were instrumental in the history of Revelstoke and the region. This woman was Elsie McKinnon, and when the hospital society, they were formed in 1901, and they built the first public hospital in 1902, and it was located where Save On Foods is now. So if people tell you they were born in the meat department of Cooper's or Save On Foods, that's what they're talking about. This was the original cottage hospital. They later moved it over to where the Legion is now. It became the first Legion building. But 1902, Elsie McKinnon came here and was very well trained. She was born in Prince Edward Island and trained in Philadelphia before joining the Victoria Order of Nursing, which was a well-known Canadian nursing order. And she worked in Quebec, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. And she was recruited by the hospital board to work here. She started work the day after her arrival in Revelstoke. They hadn't officially opened the hospital, but 2 accident cases were brought into the hospital before it was officially opened, so she got to work right away. A year later, she married Thomas Kilpatrick, who was the CPR superintendent here. He also was the president of the hospital, Revelstoke Hospital Board. So the other board members were ribbing him about taking away their matron because when she got married, she could no longer work as matron. She had a new job. It was as the head of to run her household and to have children and raise her children. So most women did not continue working once they got married. So I used this story as an example of that. And it's just a lovely photograph too of her standing on the steps of that pretty little wooden hospital. Alice Jowett is quite well known in this region. She was born in England, was either widowed or separated, and came to Canada, to Vancouver in 1891 with her 3 children. And she ran a bake shop and confectionery in Vancouver, and then heard about the mining activity in the Trout Lake area in the Lardo. So she moved to Trout Lake around 1897 and purchased a 2-story log hotel, and then later acquired the Windsor Hotel in Trout Lake, which is still there, that famous Trout Lake Hotel. And she turned it into a first-class establishment. It was a 3-story frame building and included a billiard hall, parlors, and lobby. She also acquired several mining claims and eventually became one of the most successful miners in the region. The headline in the March 28th, 1918 issue of the Revelstoke Review says, "Lady Prospector strikes it rich at Trout Lake. A trial shipment from one of her properties gave her a return of $100 a ton in gold." She continued to have quite good success in her mines and reportedly sold one property for $20,000, which is a huge sum at that time. She continued to actively work her claims until well into her 80s and to run the hotel. She finally retired in her 90s and went into a retirement home in Kelowna and died there in 1955 at the age of 101. And this is her in black in the doorway of her cabin, the Foggy Day claim. And you can see all the other people up there are women as well. This is an interesting story. This is a woman named Mary Jobe, later Mary Akeley. She first came to Revelstoke in July of 1905 with a botanical party from a college in Philadelphia collecting plant specimens. There was a man in charge of the expedition, but most of the people who were working for him were women. And they hiked into the Groundhog Basin in the Big Bend from Revelstoke, hiked in there. During the trip, one of the varieties that they found was a new variety of the spleenwort fern. At the time, Mary had a Bachelor of Arts degree and later completed a master's degree. She returned to the Selkirks and Rockies in 1909 to join an expedition for the Dominion Topographical Survey, working with a couple of surveyors. And Mount Jobe, which is near Mount Robson, is named after her. So she didn't return to Canada for quite some time. But in 1924, she married Carl Akeley, who was the African specialist at the American Museum of Natural History, New York City. So if any of you have watched A Night at the Museum movies, that's the museum. And the African gallery that features especially particularly in the first movie, is named after Carl Akeley. So Revelstoke has a connection with the Night at the Museum movies, and I think that's pretty cool. So he was traveling to Africa to acquire specimens for the museum, and she began joining him in his work. And after his death in 1926, she succeeded him as advisor in the development of the African Hall at the museum, which also became known as the Akeley Hall. So I thought that was a pretty cool story. In September of 1937, she came back to Revelstoke and did a trip along the not quite completed Big Bend Highway with Earl and Estelle Dickey and Earl's sister, Shella Dickey. And this photograph was taken at Kinbasket Lake in 1937 by Earl Dickey when they were traveling there. So it's not actually a Revelstoke woman, but has a strong connection to Revelstoke. And I find that just a really fascinating story. And of course, Isabel Corsair is our beloved ski hero. So I had to include her in the exhibit. He was born in Revelstoke in 1906. So when she participated at the Revelstoke ski tournament on February 7th, 1922, she was not quite 16 years old. She was still 15 years old. She did a jump of 88 feet and became the world's women's champion ski jumper and was really lauded for that. She wasn't allowed to do women didn't really compete. She did compete in the cusp. And she did a lot of exhibition jumps. She even did one at Mount Rainier in the 1920s and did an exhibition jump at the Côte des Neiges jump in Montreal. And they were quite amazed at the distance that she got and at her form. When she won did the jump here in 1922, he also participated in ski joring, which is skiing behind a horse. And they did that right on Mackenzie Avenue. And she won that competition as well in 1922. This is their family horse named Buckskin. The Corsair family lived um, on Front Street, right where the big apartment building is now. And so this picture is taken on Douglas. This is actually the old Needham building, which is now Alchemy Studio. And then the house next to it is still there as well. This would have been 1922. And then Anna Gunnarsson was a famous ski racer in Revelstoke. This picture was taken around 1920 by Emma Roberts. She was born in Norway in 1882 and came to Revelstoke in 1913 with her 3 sons to join her husband, Jorgen, who had come here earlier in the year with the Nelson family. And then they had a 4th son born here. They were among the charter members of the Revelstoke Ski Club in 1914 and were instrumental in establishing competitive skiing here. She was a well-known long-distance ski racer who competed in events in BC and Alberta from 1915 into the 1930s. She was still racing at the age of 48. There's one story that she had a race with the teenage boys, 17-year-old boys, and gave them a head start and still crossed the finish line in front of them, which I'm sure embarrassed them. And she would also give the women racers a head start and still beat most of them as well. And she was really supportive of her sons in their ski careers as well. The second son, Hans, was expected to rival Nels Nelson, but he enlisted as a gunner with the Canadian Army and was killed in action in 1944. And Anna died in 1956 at the age of 73. So we've got a little panel there about working women, and jobs for women were generally restricted. So, women could become nurses, teachers, secretaries, clerks, waitresses, but there was a lot of barriers to women in employment. And as I mentioned, a lot of women ended up having to give up their jobs once they married. Revelstoke actually had a nurses training school at one time. It was located behind the Brick Hospital. I think the first nurses graduated in 1915, 16 in that era, and it operated into the early 1930s. So some of these women would have actually trained at the hospital here. And I've given their family names, their maiden names in this photograph. A couple of them we had their married names as well. Telephone operators were usually women. This was the only picture we have of the telephone exchange with an operator. This would have been the Solar Telephone Company, which was operated by a company was started by William Cowan, who started the telephone service in Revelstoke. And this would have been in the little building just next to the Community Connections building on 2nd Street West, just down the street. And don't have any photographs of this. The CP Railway very rarely hired women, but during World War II, when there was a shortage of male laborers, they did hire some women to work as crew clerks, wipers on trains, and cleaning the refrigerator cars and icing the passenger trains, which involved moving 400-pound ice blocks onto the trains. There were some local women who worked at that. A lot of women were school teachers, and again, they'd usually have to give up their jobs once they got married. This is Miss Christie, and I don't know if you can see there, it says Strathcona Public School. That was actually Selkirk School. It was originally named Strathcona when they opened it in 1911, but the province really pressured them to change the name because there was another Strathcona school in Vancouver. So reluctantly, the school board changed it to Selkirk School. And of course, that was the one that was torn down in 1983, and Selkirk Gardens was later built on that property. This is Sophie Atkinson, who is our famous painter from Revelstoke. She was born in Newcastle, England in 1876 and attended art schools in Newcastle and Oxford. In 1911, she spent a year in Greece and published a book called An Artist in Corfu, which we have a copy of that in our collection. And that really sort of started her to gain prominence as an artist. She first came to Canada in 1925 and spent the next few years painting a variety of Canadian scenes. Said that Lauren Harris, who was a member of the Group of Seven, described her watercolors as among the best he had seen. On her fourth trip to Canada in 1948, she visited Mount Revelstoke and decided that she would like to stay here. So she stayed and formed the Revelstoke Art Group in 1950. She continued to paint and to teach until she returned to the UK in 1967, and she died in 1972 at the age of 95. We're actually going to be showcasing some of her works in the Revelstoke Art Gallery later this year. In March, we're opening an exhibit in Gallery 3 featuring some of her works. We've got probably over 35 Sophie Atkinson paintings in our collection. They're quite beautiful, and quite a variety of work within her paintings as well. We have two of the paintings up there now, and those paintings were given by Sophie to a woman named Hisa Hashimoto. And Hisa came to Revelstoke in the 1930s to join her husband Kunitaro, who was a crew boss for the Japanese railway crews who worked for the CPR. She initially worked as a cook for the crews, and then they later built their home. Originally, they were living in sleeper cars along the railway, and then they eventually built a house on Humbert Street. And Hisa traveled to Japan to study massage and using pressure points for therapy. And on her return, she had a little studio out of her home, and Sophie Atkinson was one of her clients. And as well as paying her for the work, Sophie gave her several paintings as well. And I think we now have 5 paintings that have been donated by Hisa's sons, Yoshi and Keen Hashimoto. And Yoshi, we interviewed him, and he said that he took watercolor lessons from Sophie as well. And he said that she was trying to tell him to be a bit more looser in his technique. But he still paints as well. There's Hisa when she was in Japan on taking the training course. Got a panel there talking about votes for women, and the suffrage movement was really active in the early 1900s, both in Britain and the US and in Canada. And Revelstoke actually became quite prominent in the work to get votes for women. In December of 1912, there was Miss J. Hardy of the BC Political Equality League wrote a letter to the editor of the Revelstoke Review. She outlined some of the legal problems of women in BC, said mothers had no rights over their children, and fathers had sole authority. Fathers could give consent for girls of 12 years and boys of 14 years to marry, and the mother's consent was not required. In the case of a deserted wife, the husband had the right to take any wages of their minor children, and in some cases, even his wife's wages. Women had no property rights. The husband could sell or give away land even if the wife's money paid for it. If a husband died without a will, the widow received only a third interest in his estate. The rest went to the husband's birth family. So these were just some of the issues that women were concerned about, and they felt that it was really imperative that women have the vote so that they could have some influence over these laws. And the Women's Canadian Club, which formed in 1913, was quite active in the suffrage movement. They invited well-known suffrage activists, including Nellie McClung, who came here a couple of times. These are her signatures in the Women's Canadian Club guest book from 1915 and 1918. And then Emmeline Pankhurst, who was a well-known British suffragette. She was in Canada in 1916 on a tour and gave a talk to the Women's Canadian Club as well. There was also a local woman, Florence Lashley Hall. She was on the executive of the Political Equality League and was traveling around the province talking to women's groups about the importance of gaining votes for women and how to influence the men to vote for women's suffrage. She actually moved to Revelstoke in 1913 with her husband, who was a Methodist minister, and she was leading the provincial campaign from here. So Revelstoke was quite involved in the suffrage movement. So finally, in the provincial election in the fall of 1916, the male voters agreed to give women the franchise, and that was ratified in 1917. And then in 1918, the federal vote was extended to all white women. But of course, there was still voting inequality because Chinese Canadians, South Asians, and Japanese Canadians didn't have the right to vote until the late 1940s, and status Indigenous people had to wait until 1960 before they were able to vote. So the women's suffrage movement was just one step in the battle for voting equality. We have a panel there called Adeline Louis Barr. That panel was written by Laura Stovall. Adeline was a Snipes woman who's in her lifespan more than a century. She was born in 1872 near Kettle Falls, Washington, and her sort of why we talk about her is because of an incident that happened at Galena Bay in April of 1894 when she was with her husband Jim, who's referred to in the papers as Cultist Jim, but we don't use the term cultist anymore because it was considered a derogatory term. So we refer to him just as Jim. We don't know any other name. We don't have a surname or any other name for him. But they were at what's now Galena Bay, and they had traps set there, and they encountered a man named Sam Hill, who was a farmer who'd preempted some land in the area, and they asked him to stop his work while because they had bear traps set in the area, and he refused and said, "This is my land, get off of my land." In the end, Jim ended up shot and killed, and Adeline was terrified and left. Sam Hill, the man who shot Jim, was initially they were going to not even bring it to trial at all. They were just saying, "Oh, it was self-defense, don't worry about it." But they ended up doing a trial. They brought him, they had an initial trial in Revelstoke. They went looking for Adeline as a witness. She was in the cusp by that time. They brought her to Revelstoke forcibly. And she, at the preliminary trial, she gave her evidence, which was really difficult because she spoke very little English and they didn't have a proper translator for her. So her testimony was never properly gathered or taken into account. She was kept in Revelstoke until the trial in October of 1894. She was not allowed to leave town. Sam Hill was out on bail, so he could go back to Galena Bay and work on his property, but Adeline was forced to stay here. Sam Hill was acquitted at the trial, and then Adeline left to find her family, eventually remarried twice, and we have an interview with her that we've included in our videos here with Lorraine Wiley, who's the great-granddaughter of Adeline, and Laura interviewed her. And she just remembers her as a very old lady when she was a child, but remembers that sometimes they'd be trying to sleep and she'd be sitting in the kitchen with her pounding her stick on the floor and doing her winter dance songs. she kept her traditions. She didn't like white people, which was quite understandable. Definitely had a difficult life, but it was quite amazing. She lived as long as she did, and sort of really carried her traditions down to her family. And it was because of her example that her great granddaughter, Lorraine Wiley, um, felt that it was important to really keep their language alive. And she and her husband, uh, Chris, started the Sailor School of Spokane, which is dedicated to teaching the Insulchan language in their area. We have some of their videos of their school included in our exhibit. It's the next exhibit downstairs. Um, she died she lived to the age of 106. And, was buried in the cemetery at Kelly Hill. Now we have a photograph of the church, that area that her funeral would have been at. And the great granddaughter, Lorraine, remembers how she would braid her hair every morning, and Lorraine keeps that practice as well. She says, as I braid my hair, I pray and think about my ancestors. It's just a reminder that I can be strong, I can keep going. So we also included, these are some beaded leather gloves that were made by Adeline. The family has a couple of pairs of her beadwork. We also included in the exhibit a section called Japanese Canadian Voices. The Japanese history in Revelstoke is something that was really not widely told, and thought it was an important story to try to bring this history to light. I know, for quite a few years working here, I really didn't have much of a sense of the early Japanese community. I knew about the 1910 Rogers Pass avalanche that killed 58 people, and that 32 of them were Japanese. So I knew that there were Japanese here, but I didn't really sort of connect them to the community. But I sort of saw them as a transient population, and that's true to a certain extent. But there were a lot of Japanese workers in this area from 1900 onward, and so we devoted a fair section of the exhibit to talking about the Japanese Canadian history. Um, they were a largely hidden community. I did find um, newspaper accounts, it was often because somebody died in a grisly manner, or because they had committed a crime. So it was really kind of a hidden story. Um, Official records give us a bit of a clue to the people who are here. According to the 1911 census, there were 144 Japanese Canadian people living in the area, including at Malaqua, Taft, Three Valley, Arrowhead, Comaplik, and just east of Revelstoke on the railway right of way. Almost all of them were working on railway labor gangs or in sawmills. There was a company called the Nippon Supply Company, which was actually a labor broker firm that employed the majority of the Japanese workers and arranged for crews for the jobs in the mills and on the railway. According to the vital events records, I found that there were 79 Japanese Canadian people who died in Revelstoke and the surrounding area between 1904 and 1936, so before World War II. Of those people, fewer than 25 were mentioned in the local newspaper, and many of those didn't include the name of the person who died. We have this article from the Revelstoke Mail Herald, August 8th, 1914. Japanese is killed by passenger train. While walking on the railway track this morning near Taft, a Japanese was struck by train number 2 and killed. His body was brought to Revelstoke and is now at our house and company's undertaking parlors. And then there was a further note about him being buried and some of his countrymen coming to the ceremony, but again, they didn't mention his name. For the vital events records, I was able to determine that his name was Kei Miyashita, and he was age 32. And he was buried in the Mountain View Cemetery here in Revelstoke in an unmarked grave. In 1904, I found mention of a man named Yodo Fuji, who was operating the Owl Restaurant out of a bottom story of a boarding house at 201 First Street East. The building is still there as a little apartment block. And the restaurant appears to be short-lived. I was only able to find the ads between March and September of 1904. But that was Revelstoke's first Japanese restaurant. Had an interesting visit earlier last year. A woman was in town, and she told me that her name was Bernice Shiosaki, and she actually came here for Alan McGinnis's service because she had actually stayed with the McGinnis's while she was doing her teacher training here, and she ended up teaching here. But she said, I think my grandfather lived in Revelstoke. And she was also looking for information on an uncle of hers that had died north of Revelstoke in 1959. And so I was able to find his death certificate online and discovered that he was born in Revelstoke in, I can't remember the exact year, 1913. And that he had an older sister, Mary, who was born in Revelstoke in 1911. And then on the in the obituary of the Nelson Shiosaki, the man who died in 1959, one of the sons, it said that that he had been working for C.B. Hume and running the ranch, C.B. Hume's ranch near Williamson's Lake. Bernice also had a story that her grandfather had worked as a chauffeur for one of the mayors of Revelstoke. I wasn't able to find out whether that story was true or not. But they were a family, a Japanese family that was actually settled and living in Revelstoke and had their children born here in the early 1900s.
He was supposed to be a chauffeur.
It'd be like probably they were here between about 1910 and probably in the 1920s. So it could have been McKinnon, but I'm not, because McKinnon was definitely
someone had gone to Japan to get white and brought back.
Oh, okay. I'll talk to you later about that. Interesting. Could be that family. That I'm not entirely sure. I know that C.B. Hume, he bought the Williamson's ranch, and the Williamson's ranch actually abutted right up to the lake. But I'm not sure how far the ranch extended. It could be close to where the airport is too. So they grew apples there. So it was there were probably apple trees. They also had strawberry plants there. They had quite a big strawberry farm because strawberries were one of the biggest cash crops in Revelstoke. Okay. Okay, that could be. It could be. Yeah. We used to go for drives down there all the time. Okay. Trying to be dry. Yeah, this picture's around 1915, so yeah, that could be. I'll talk to see if anybody has any ideas. I'm not that great about figuring out, location from the photographs, but if anybody can help me figure that out, that'd be great. So we also found a lot of information through digging on a man named Choichiro Takahashi, and he was in Revelstoke as early as 1910, working as a section foreman with the Canadian Pacific Railway. He and his wife Sue had several children, and two of his sons worked as bakers for Gallicano Bakery. And Ryozo Takahashi, also known as Leo, owned the business for several years, and he lived on 2nd Street West, and actually had a boarding house there as well. 5 generations of the Takahashi family lived in Revelstoke between 1910 and 2007. The last member was Sho Takahashi and his wife Hozumi, who's Hozumi Nakamura, and they had come here during the Second World War. And Sho passed away, but Hozumi is still living at the coast. So, the and Cho actually was born in Japan because families would go back and forth. So, and especially, you know, when they, like during the war, you know, a lot of families ended up sort of being stuck in Japan and not able to return for several years. So Cho had come back here as a child with his mother after the war, and then lived here and got married here and spent the rest of his life in this area. Um, so the Second World War definitely had a huge impact on the Japanese Canadian community. There were a lot of families who were living at the coast. A lot of them, some of them were very, very successful. A lot of them owned fishing boats, stores, businesses, you know, vehicles, and you know, we're doing very, very well. Once World War II happened and Japan, well, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and then Canada was among the countries who declared war on Japan. And under the War Measures Act, all Japanese Canadians on the west coast of British Columbia were forced to leave the area in 1942, regardless of birthplace or citizenship, and all of their property was seized. I haven't quite figured out yet. I'm still working on trying to find out like how families were able to come to Revelstoke, but there were quite a few that came here that have managed to avoid being put in internment camps. So, you know, there were internment camps at near Hope, at Tashme, and in the Greenwood area near Grand Forks, and in the Kootenays like Caslow, New Denver, Slocan, Lemon Creek. There were Sandon. You know, there were a lot of internment camps, but there were up to 60 families that managed to come to Revelstoke during the Second World War. They did have to get permission from the RCMP to come, but I'm not sure. We haven't been able to figure out yet exactly what the process was that they were able to come here. Uh, the uh, the municipal government, the city council, quickly made a decision that they would not allow any Japanese evacuees to live within the city limits. There was a couple of families that were living within the city limits, like the Takahashi family. They didn't move them out, but they would not allow the Takahashis to take boarders in. They would not allow them to live within city limits. The saving grace for these people was that the city was a lot smaller than it is now. So Downey Street was the boundary of the city, and the outskirts of town, or you know, out the district. So they could, if they could find somebody who would willing to rent them a house, they were able to live south of Downey Street. And Big Eddy also was not part of the city at the time, so quite a few families settled in Big Eddy. This little boy, he visited the museum quite a few years ago and gave us some photographs, and said that when they came here in 1942, they settled in the Big Eddy, and they initially had this really rundown shack to live in, but his father was able to talk to somebody and get a better house for them. So they lived there for the duration of the war. Quite a few families stayed here after the war as well, but some they left. Some of them went back to Japan. The government of Canada was trying to encourage a lot of the Japanese people to return to Japan. Some of them did. Some of them eventually came back to Canada, but some of them stayed in Japan. But there was it was quite a bit of an uproar for the people that were displaced to here. In a minute, I'll talk about some of the specific families that lived here as well. Well, after the war, it took a while for for Revelstoke to really accept the Japanese community. One of the things, like the Revelstoke Golf Club had in 1942, they had passed a resolution that no Japanese people would be allowed to join the Revelstoke Golf Club. And it was, let's see, the date here. Yeah, in May of 1942, they denied all those of Japanese descent access to the golf course. And they ratified that in 1947, 2 years after the war ended. And then in April of 1914, members of the Japanese Canadian Citizens Association requested that their members be allowed to join the club. And three of the members wanted to continue the ban, but 24 members voted to overturn it. So they allowed the Japanese players to join the golf club. But that was 1949 before they reversed that. Also after the war, in 1947, representatives of the Revelstoke branch of the Legion attended a meeting of the city council and asked the city council, to not allow Japanese businessmen to open businesses in Revelstoke. And some of the councillors liked that idea, but not all of them did. And in order for that a ban to pass, it had to be a unanimous vote. So Japanese people were allowed to open businesses at that time. And I'll talk in a couple of minutes about some of the families that did open businesses here. One thing I want to mention too is that when we were doing this research, we used a lot of sources. We have we have British Columbia directories from the 1940s, and I went through there and looked to find any Japanese names I could have. And the good thing about those directories is that sometimes they'd actually list the employer of the person. And we found several Japanese Canadian men in the 40s during the war who were working for Pratolini Brothers Construction. And that was a company that was a local company there. It was the two brothers were running it by that time. Their father had started the company in the early 1900s. He was one of the people who Anselmo Pratolini was one of the main contractors on the courthouse and several other prominent local buildings. So their sons were running this construction company, and they hired several Japanese men. One of the men that they hired was Fuji Sakiyama, and he went on to buy the company and started it as Revelstoke Building Supplies, and that was later became Revelstoke Home Hardware. And that's his daughter-in-law Harumi is our archivist, and she's the one who did a lot of this work with me and a lot of this research. We actually have some funding now to continue our work into the Japanese community, and we'll be doing a lot more on that this year. And I'm going to be doing a talk on the Japanese community later this year, so I won't talk too much more about it. But a few more photographs here. There were work camps between here and Sicamous, where young men were interned and put to work on the railway upgrade or highway upgrades between here and Sicamous. And those operated for several years. I've talked quite a bit about that in the past as well. In 1953, relations had really repaired quite a bit between Canada and Japan. And the Crown Prince Akihito visited Revelstoke, or had a brief stop at the station when he was on a cross-country tour in 1953. He was just 19 years old at the time. And this is Ryozo Takahashi, and this is Roy Shoji, and there's other members of the Japanese community there. And that's Mayor Walter Hardman, and this is John, about his last name, Murdoch. So I mentioned the Hashimoto family. They were actually one of the early families to settle in Revelstoke. We know that Kunitaro Hashimoto was working for the railway by 1910, and he came at the age of 28 with his first wife, Fude. He was a bookman for a railway gang of Japanese workers, so he was in charge of their work schedules and acted as a translator. And he was literate in both Japanese and English. When we interviewed his son Yoshi remembered his father having this really huge English dictionary that was his prized possession. After Fude died in 1923, he married Hisha Nishino, They had 6 children, 5 of whom were born in Revelstoke. Some of the older children were sent to Japan, where they were raised by relatives. And one of the sons still lives in town. I've forgotten his name, his first name at the moment. It lives on 4th Street. And yes, yeah, yeah. And so when Canada declared war on Japan, Kunitara was forced out of his job with the railway, supposedly for security reasons. So he was able to work at some of the local farms, the local dairies, and with construction companies. And Yoshu said they had a really large garden, which helped to sustain them during the war years, and that they were already outside of city limits. This is another story that was really kind of recovered, just found out about this last year when I was working on this. People just started coming in the doors with stories that related to our project. It was pretty amazing. But this fellow here, the baby, his name is Haruji Mizuta, and he was born in Revelstoke in 1833. These are his parents, Chizaburo and Kane. And he worked for the railway, and they were living in boarding cars. And in 1936, there was March 2nd, 1936, there was a big accident near Illecillewaet, 26 miles east of Revelstoke. An engine had been derailed, and the tender was hooked up to an auxiliary locomotive. Well, it was being moved up the tracks. An emergency stop was made because the engineer thought another slide was coming down. And due to the sudden stop, the tender was not properly attached to the engine, and it detached and accelerated back down into the cut where these men were working and literally mowed them down. 16 men died. 4 of them were Japanese Canadian laborers. Jusaburo was able to just get out of the way in time, ended up with a broken leg, and was lost consciousness and woke up in the hospital, and had a broken leg, which his son said never properly healed. But while he was still in the hospital, his wife was also there giving birth to their daughter, Asako. So she was born there in March of 1936. And Haruji and Asako are both still alive. And they sent us all these photographs and documents. And so we've been able to get this information, which we didn't have before. This was new information to us. So, and I absolutely love the family photographs. They're very, very sweet. We have quite a bit of information on the Wakita family. Hirumi was able to get a lot of photographs from the family members. And as mentioned, they came here during the war. Mr. Wakita was born in Japan in 1887, and he and his wife, Uno, had 6 daughters and 2 sons. Most of them were born in Steveston, BC between 1915 and 1931. And they had a general store in Steveston. So when they came here in April of 1942 with the 4 youngest children, and one of the children was Yai, who became Yai Hayashi. A lot of people will remember her. And she talks about being afraid to go to school. And in fact, the city council they didn't want the Japanese children to go into the schools, but that was not a decision that they could make. So the Yai said that the teacher and the principal actually came to their house and said, "We want you to come to school." And so she attended school in Revelstoke. She married Dennis Hayashi, and they had some successful businesses in town, including Gail Jean Ladies Wear and Daspy's Ladies Wear. Then her parents, after the war, they were able to buy the old Bregalisi store on where Beriski Park is now. And they didn't change the name right away because they knew that there was still a lot of people who didn't, who were, there was anti-Japanese sentiment. So they kept the name Bregalisi for a while. But this is Mas Wakita, who became Mas Ora. And they were the ones who ended up running the red and white store for many years. And Mass is still alive. She had her 100th birthday in 2024. I'm going to skip over quite a bit because I'll be doing a talk on the Japanese community in May as well. But the Shoji family was also a really significant family, and they had to fight to get a business license as well. But he started the Snow White Laundry, and then his son Yosh, who a lot of people will remember, Yosh, ended up running the company. That was at the location where Cheers beer and wine store is now, on Victoria and Orton. And they decided to have a room built in their house that was a Japanese style room. And they hired a craftsman to come in and construct it. And they also brought in a lot of material from Japan specifically for the room. And that was a lovely picture of Mr. Shoji and Kozumi Nakamura and Sheila Shoji and Mrs. Shoji Matsui in their home in the 1950s. And that's another story that we kind of uncovered was the Amano family. And we discovered that there was actually a manufacturing of soybean sauce, bean and rice products in Revelstoke. And 413 2nd Street West is next to where the red and white was. It was the Wakitas ended up buying that and ran it as a frozen meat locker business. But that was the Amano store. It was torn down, and there's a new building up there now where Chronometer is, some other businesses. But that was that was a surprise to discover that there was actually a soy company in Revelstoke. They moved back to the coast in the early 1950s, and the company is still operating. This is Graham and Linda Amano. Graham is the grandson of the originator of the company, Mr. Amano. And you can buy the Amano products. I know you can get them in. I've seen them in Southside. We've got one of the packages from their one of their products there in the case. So I think I might leave it there. I'll just maybe tell a couple of stories. We have a panel as well called Children's Voices. I start by saying, there was that old saying, children should be seen, not heard. And so children's points of view weren't always considered back in the day, but there were some pretty interesting stories from the Revelstoke children as well. This was Mary Edwards, who was part of her aunt was Lida Holton, so she ended up growing up in the Holton house, and then married Dr. Hamilton, who was a well-known early doctor in Revelstoke. And the Fraser family had the first farm in the area in the Big Eddy, and their children were cited as the first white children to be born in Revelstoke. When the daughters and the son were some of the first children to be actually born here. And I've talked about them as well, so I'll just not go into that in too much detail right now. Just this story, Helen Parker. Her mother was Eva Hobbs Parker, the woman that Eva Lake is named after. And when she was 10 years old in 1928, there was a man in town who was named Fred St. Onge, who was a cycling expert. And he was here to demonstrate bicycle techniques and safety to children. And as a little trick, he set up this 150-foot long, 5-inch wide plank and invited the children to try to ride it. And Helen, who was 10 years old, had her mother's bike, and she managed to ride the plank 16 times in 20 feet for a total of 2,420 feet, which broke his previous record of any children of only 830 feet. So she won a box of chocolates and a gold medal, and she actually donated the medal to the museum. So we have the medal in our collection now. And then also wanted to mention this photograph because this is Ken's family. So Jack, Dick, Jim, and George. Jim was Ken's dad. Around 1930, they lived in the house at the bottom of Douglas Street Hill, and they came to Revelstoke in 1920. The four boys had been born elsewhere, and they moved here. The two youngest boys there, Jim and George, were identical twins. And two daughters were born in Revelstoke, Marion and Marjorie. And when Marjorie was still an infant, Mr. English left. He left his wife and 6 children and took off. I'm not sure, you've heard various versions of the story, but he left his wife and 6 children. So there was no welfare back then. So she started selling. She was a school teacher, but she couldn't work as a teacher yet because she had very young children. So she sold Spirella corsets, and all of the kids started working. And when they were quite young, they were delivering papers. They worked with a man named Mr. Bailey. I think that's Mr. Bailey's horse. He delivered hay and firewood, and he would also cut ice out of the Columbia River and deliver ice. So the boys all would be helping chopping ice out of the river. And Jim, Ken's dad, said that more than once he had to haul George out of the water when he fell in when they were cutting ice. So those kids worked really hard. And they all ended up doing really well. Like Jack was worked for, he was with BC Hydro as a top accountant, chief accountant for BC Hydro. Dick worked for the Department of Highways for years as a supervisor. Jim had the J.K. English and Sons jewelry store, where Big Bend Cafe is now on Pensy Avenue. George died during the Second World War in an accident, a training accident in Quebec. I think I'm, maybe leave there just a few more little photographs. I also included this photograph of the 3 of the Wakita children, Hajime, Yai, and Jutaka. And this is Sheila Shoji in their Japanese room in their house. And then a couple of other photographs here. So next Brown Bag History is Wednesday, February 19th. It's called Pastimes and Past Times, just the BC Heritage Week theme. And Laura Van Zandt is going to be doing that one. I'm going to be going down to Victoria for the BC or the Canadian Museums Association Symposium. And I'll tell you something that happens there when I come back. Something that's going to be happening at that. But I'll be away that week, so Laura will be doing that. So thank you for coming today.